What is up, everybody? VitalSyntax here, and this video is going to show you my recommended settings for Battlefield 3 on the PC. So you console players might not enjoy the video too much, but hopefully my goal for the PC players is to make your game run, look, and sound the best that it possibly can. Let's go ahead and open up the options settings and talk about mouse sensitivity first. So by default, mouse sensitivity is set to 100. Keep in mind you can click on the setting and use your arrow keys to set exactly the number you want. I've set mine to 20. Now the reason I have a lower sensitivity than the default one is the lower your sensitivity is, the more accurate and more precise you can be. Some people recommend high sensitivities. I recommend low sensitivities so you can be more precise, especially in a game like Battlefield 3, and I'll show you guys that right now. So say for example, I'm trying to shoot this light right here, and I ADS a little bit off to the right. Now if you have a high sensitivity, it's hard to adjust a minuscule aim position like this. With a low sensitivity, it's very easy. It's very easy to move your aimer around in small increments. But if you're on high sensitivity, obviously it's going to be more difficult. So what a lot of people do that have high sensitivities is they'll use their strafing mechanic, the WASD movement, to correct their aiming. And so let's say I aim over here, I'll move over to the left a little bit, now I'm aimed right there. The problem with that is while you move in Battlefield 3, it decreases your weapon's accuracy significantly. So you want to stand still as much as possible when firing from medium to long ranges. Obviously if you're at close range, it's fine to try and maneuver and dodge bullets and hip fire at the same time. But longer ranges, medium and long, you definitely want to stand still, control bursts, and not move around back and forth. And I see a lot of people do this too. They'll strafe back and forth in little like this. That's not going to dodge bullets. Trust me, it won't. And at the same time, you're decreasing your weapon's accuracy. So stand still and do short controlled bursts. Alright, moving on to the next setting is going to be over in gameplay. Talk about the minimap. So the minimap by default is set to map. You also have hybrid and satellite. So let's switch into the game again, and I'll show you guys what the map looks like. So I'm going to press M here. It's going to make the map really big so you can see it in full detail. You can see that the map version of the map is very simple. It's also very straightforward. Now if I press B on my keyboard, it's going to change to hybrid mode, which is the map and the satellite version put together, so I can see a little bit more detail. Now I press B again, it's going to go just to satellite, which is kind of hard to make out where the important parts of the map are. So once again, I'm going to suggest that you run the hybrid version. Alright, let's pull the settings back up real quick. Next thing I want to talk about is one I skipped over here, is network smoothing factor. I have mine set all the way up. Some people suggest you turn it all the way down. Now let's quickly read the description of this setting. You can see visual smoothing of network data such as players and objects. Lowering will reduce latency but could increase visual errors. So obviously it's very important to decrease latency as much as possible, but in the real tests that I've done, real life tests, this setting really seems to work best when you have it turned on. Now if you have it turned off, yeah, you might have a little bit faster connection to the server, but things like enemies vaulting over objects, vehicles moving around, enemies running are very choppy, at least in my experience. And it makes it hard to hit targets that are choppy and hard, moving around all strange like. So in my opinion, turning the network smoothing factor all the way up is how it works for me. You might want to turn it halfway, or you might even want to turn it all the way off if you don't have any visual errors. It kind of depends on your situation and your connection to the server, really. Alright, moving on to audio. Now, audio is kind of controversial because we don't have any direct information from DICE exactly how these different settings work. But the most common one I see people using is war tapes. Now, war tapes is, in my opinion, the worst one you can use. Now, I turned war tapes on here real quickly. You can hear the rain patter got a little bit louder. And the reason is because from the research I've done, keep in mind this is not directly from DICE, this is not confirmed information, but from what I've read, what war tapes does is it increases the high and low frequencies, making them louder. So things like guns and grenades are going to sound crisper, and you're going to be able to hear shrapnel flying around, hitting cement, hitting walls. You're going to be able to hear the casings from your bullets hitting the ground. So it gives you a nice clean cinematic, except it's going to be hard to hear things like footsteps and other mid-range audios. So my suggestion is to not use war tapes and use hi-fi. It also depends on if you're using headphones or not. If you're using headphones, you might also want to consider the headphone option. I found hi-fi also works pretty well, and that's what I stick to. Now, as far as enhanced stereo mode goes, if you have a virtual surround sound headset, which a lot of gamers do, make sure you have this system turned off, because your mix amp or your sound card, whether it's a USB sound card or actual PCI sound card, that's already doing the virtual surround sound matrix for you, and you don't want the game to do it as well, because then you're going to have some weird errors and issues with the audio. If you're using a stereo headset that only has 2 speakers and that's not virtual surround sound, you want to turn that on, give you a little bit more surround sound experience. You can a little more positional audio. Alright, moving on to video. I have it set to full screen off, so technically it's windowed mode, but at the same time I'm running a third-party plugin, or I guess it's a third-party program, that's called BF3 Borderless. It makes the Battlefield 3 window borderless, meaning I have the entire screen at my disposal. I can see a lot more. The reason I do that is because full screen, I want to use my entire screen, but I also want the ability to switch between windows very quickly that windowed mode offers, so borderless kind of gives you the best of both worlds. Alright, moving on to field of view. This is another one that I see a lot of people using incorrectly. I see a lot of PC players, probably the majority of PC players, running at 90 FPS. And I'll quickly jump back in game, and when I press sprint, it's going to update the FOV. Alright, so you can see the FOV's changed to 90 now. You can see my peripheral vision left and right is a lot higher, but objects are smaller. So there is a disadvantage and an advantage to both running a high and a low field of view. So on a high field of view, I have a lot more positional awareness. I can see left and right a lot easier, but my targets are a lot smaller, so it's a lot harder to be accurate and hit them. Now, the problem with running a super low sensor FOV like 60 is that I can't see left and right. I'm not as positionally aware as I was when I was playing at 90, but my targets are huge. So my suggestion is to use the default setting, which is 70 FOV. Another viable option is 80 or 75. I don't think anybody should play above 80, and I think all the people that are playing at 90 need to get over the fact that you don't need to play on the highest field of view, and it might take a while to get used to. Maybe just turn it down to 85 for a day, and then turn down to 80, and 75, and then 70. Maybe you want to go back to 75. But somewhere between 70 and 80 is what I find is the best balance between field of vision, left and right field of vision, or field of view, and also making objects a good size so that you can see them easily and hit them easily. Alright, moving on, we've got the colorblind support. So I have this turned on, although I'm not colorblind. Now the reason I do this, and it's kind of hard to demonstrate since I don't have anybody else on the server with me, is that it makes teammates and enemies, the little icons above their head or on the mini-map or on your radar or on your screen on the HUD, it makes them pop out a little bit more because it gives them a different color. It's either yellow or pink instead of red and blue. And it also gives it a very, very dark shadow behind it. So they feel the pop a little bit more, and in my opinion it makes it a little bit easier to see enemies and see your teammates on the minimap or on your screen. Alright, moving on to the actual graphics settings. This is going to be probably the bulk of the video because it's going to talk about all the different really combinations you can do, which ones are going to have the biggest effect on your frames per second, which ones are going to have the biggest effect on the actual look and feel of the game. And really what it comes down to is the hardware of your computer. If you have a high-end system, something like a GTX 570, 580, or 680, you're obviously running high settings. If you have a lower-end graphics card or you have a lower-end CPU that's maybe bottlenecking your system, you want to run lower settings. Really what it comes down to is, and this is once again in my opinion, the whole video is in my opinion, but anyway, the most important thing is to have the game run at the highest FPS as long as it's at 60. Now if you're using a 60 Hz monitor, you're not going to be able to see any frame rate higher than 60. If you're running a 120 Hz monitor, obviously same thing, you can't see anything higher than 120 FPS. Most people, I would say 90%, maybe even more, 95%, use 60 Hz monitors. So it doesn't matter if you're running at 90 frames per second, you're still only going to be seeing 60 frames per second. But a lot of people are also on laptops where they have lower end systems. And I think, in my opinion, that you want to run lower settings to get higher frame rates, more towards 60, than running higher graphic settings that make the game look a little bit better, but make the game run choppier. It's a lot harder to play when the game is choppy. Alright, so texture quality really comes down to the amount of gigabytes that your video card has for memory. So if you have something like a 1.5 gigabyte DDR5 card, or even a 2 or 3 gigabyte card, you're obviously going to want to run ultra settings, because it can hold a lot of data in that memory. If you're running something like a 1 gigabyte card, you might want to run high. If you're running like a 512 megabyte or megabyte memory card, you might want to run medium or low. Shadow quality is going to have a pretty big hit on your actual frame rate. So let's quickly do a test here. I'm running it at low here, and I'm getting 65 frames per second, which is totally acceptable. Now I turn on to ultra, and I drop down to 59, so about 7 FPS drop, which is a pretty big hit, considering that I'm not getting that huge performance, or not huge graphical improvement. Yeah, it makes the shadows look very smooth, very soft, but in my opinion, I usually run it on medium, because the low is very jittery, it's very sharp, and it doesn't look very realistic as far as shadows go. Medium rounds those shadows out pretty nicely, and anything above that really doesn't have that huge hit to graphical performance. So moving on to effect quality, this is going to basically affect you when you have explosions or dust and things like that moving around. So if you have a huge dip in performance when an explosion goes off, you might want to turn that down. I have it set to high. Mesh quality is, for example, let's say I'm rendering a car. If I have it set to low mesh quality, it's just going to render the tire. If I have it set to ultra mesh quality, it's going to render each bolt that holds the hubcap of that tire. So the higher, it's going to be more detail. Also, you're going to have to use more video RAM to hold more mesh. Moving on to terrain quality, this is the number of triangles or tessellation that recreate a landscape. So the higher the number, the more triangles, making a smoother landscape. It's not going to have a huge hit in performance in my tests though, so I run it on high. Terrain decorations would be like plants, flowers, grass, things like that. Not a huge hit on performance. Once again, I run that on high. Anti-aliasing, there's two versions. There's deferred and there's post. I suggest everybody run deferred on off unless you have a very high-end system, and running post on medium or even high. Now post, let's do a quick test again. I'm going to turn both of them off here, getting 65 frames per second. Now I turn deferred all the way up to 4 times MSAA. I'm getting 45. That's a full 20 frames per second drop from just turning one setting on to its highest setting, which is a huge difference in actual frames per second. Now it does make the game look very smooth. It means that edges and corners are very round and very smooth instead of crisp and rugged. Now if I turn anti-aliasing post off, I'm getting 65, and if I turn it all the way to high, I'm still getting 65. 0 frames per second drop. Now it might not be the same for everybody. You might get 1 or 2 frames per second difference, but really it's not going to be that huge of a change. I run it on medium, and I suggest you guys either run that on medium or high and turn deferred off. Alright, moving on to motion blur. This is all about personal preference. I use it, and I also have it set to 50% over here, so I have it turned on. There's 2 reasons. I like the way it looks. Some people absolutely hate it. It's kind of a love or hate situation. Also, it makes my YouTube videos look a little bit smoother, since YouTube only runs at 30 frames per second. The motion blur makes it look a little bit more smooth. Anisotropic filtering, I haven't had any change in performance if I'm running this at 1 times. It's still at 65 frames per second. If I run it at 16, it's still at 65 frames per second. If you don't know what this does, it's kind of hard to explain in words. If you want to research a little more on Wikipedia or Google, you can do that. But from my understanding, it makes textures that are at an angle from your viewpoint look a little bit better than if they were kind of muddled because you're seeing them at an angle. Ambient occlusion is default set to HBAO, and there's also an SSAO. And what this does is it makes its shadows look darker in certain situations and lighter in other situations. So it makes it look a little more realistic when it comes to shadows, but it has a huge performance hit. So let's say I turn it off, I'm getting 65 frames per second, and I turn it to HBAO, and I'm getting 55 frames per second. So not quite as big of a frame drop as I got from the deferred anti-aliasing, but still 10 frames per second is a very big change. So I suggest either turning this off completely, unless you have a very high-end system and you want to turn it on and you're still above 60 FPS if you're on a 60 Hz monitor. Alright, so that's about it. I'm not going to go over all my key bindings. I really haven't changed too much. Really, the most important thing when it comes to key bindings is that you can access all your equipment, all your weapons, with one hand without having to move it around too much. But that's basically all the recommended settings I have for Battlefield 3 on the PC. Hopefully it helps you guys run the game, make it look and sound the best that it possibly can. If it helped you guys out, feel free to give me a like or a favorite, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.